Okay, awesome. So, as I mentioned, we are Salt City Data Community. We've been doing this for a couple of years now and are excited to start the new arc of data and industry. So today's is an overview of business use, and then we'll dive into specific sectors as we go throughout the year. So one note on this particular arc is that we will be doing a templated structure. So we will be touching on the exact same points and details within every single session that we have so that we can do comparisons across industries. So you'll be able to see the overview, the history of data in business. And then in the finance sector, you'll be able to see that history and compare against the other industries that we go through. Um, okay, so data in business has a long history, and particularly in the last decade, it has had a huge economic impact. So there's always been, or not always, but for about a decade, there's been big headlines around data. Data is the next, data is the next big job. How do you turn your mountains of data into true analysis? This has kind of been the trendy topic for a long time, particularly as it applies to business and profit margins. So as you can see here, I have a couple stats up. Organizations using data as a central driver, particularly to their strategic goals, show a $10.7 million advantage annually over those not using data. And the definition of not using data is not using data at all. It's not being proactive about your data approach, because all companies use data. It's just whether you actually are using that data to drive your business forward or you're just using spreadsheets to track things. And we'll get into that kind of data maturity in a little bit. Supply chain is a huge space for efficiencies from data, particularly as IoT has grown and the capabilities for streaming has gained not only a foothold in the businesses, but also gained human resources that have the technical capabilities to analyze that streaming data. So these efficiencies generate a $7.6 million profit annually in orgs that are data leaders. So what that means is the efficiencies themselves are decreasing cost by a significant enough amount to identify it as profit. So it's no longer just a decrease in cost, but actually a profit center. And then going back to sensors, we have gone from a world with very few sensors to a world with a lot of sensors. One moment. Okay, so so that's a bit of an introduction to our data structure, and kind of how we're going to approach this session. So now I want to get into a little bit of history. So these are far and away not a comprehensive view of what data history is, especially data in business. There is so much more to it, but the key points that I want to touch on are really the introduction of data as a separate entity from statistics and mathematics. And this was written, The Future of Data Analysis was written by John Tukey. And this really, this was kind of a industry shattering write-up. So this book was really an ultimate definition of data as its own entity, as opposed to computer programming or statistics. So creating that niche capability really started data down the path of where we are today. So next, in 1968, Peter Nahr proposed a course on dataology, which is the study of data, to the IFIP. And so that was pretty key in the growth of data, because it's now being recognized by international organizations as its own entity, as its own driving force. Next, in 1977, the International Association for Statistical Computing is founded. So while this kind of brings back the language to both statistics and computer programming, ultimately this is an association meant solely for the proliferation and build of the data industry itself, not necessarily specifically statistics and computing, but how those things impact the way that we can use and structure data. And then in 1994, data was the cover of Business Week, and the collection of data by organizations really was the collection of data by the organizations was understood, and data was being collected at a rate that had been unheard of previously. But the ability to use, structure, and analyze that data in a way that was comprehensive and able to be communicated to non-technical users, so those business users, none of that had really been grasped yet, and none of that was able to truly be leveraged at the rate that it is today. So then finally, I see that I forgot to add this as a piece of content, but in 2007, the chief economic officer of Google defined data as the sexy job of the decade. So they identified these are the jobs that we're going to want. And they compared it to computer programming positions in the early 90s, when we really were on that initial tech bubble. And so that really brought a lot of talent from other industries, from other educational paths into data science. So here, this is a quote from the Business Week article. Companies are collecting mountains of information about you, crunching it to predict how likely you are to buy a product, and using that knowledge to craft a marketing message precisely calibrated to get you to do so. And this is where all of this history is driving to. As you can imagine, that was in 1994 when this quote was written. Today, that is astronomically even more the case. So if something could be more true, that is more true today than it was in 1994. Okay, so next we're gonna get into who's who. And here I wanted to touch on a few different really innovative growth creators across the industry. So initially, Henry Ford. The design of his warehouses, the construction of how the Model T was built, this was really driven off of supply chain analytics ultimately, and the ability to then put a car together in 90 minutes became the driving force of really the industrial complex of the United States for the next few decades. This really became the competitive advantage that any other industry was attempting to best. And because of that, more and more organizations started bringing data as a central use into their organizations. Okay, next in 1931, IBM's Columbia Difference Tabulator, or more commonly known as the Packard, was released. This was built for Columbia University. The Packard took up multiple office rooms. Imagine like a large library and just covered in servers. And that is what this first Packard was. But what this did is it created the capability to do what Henry Ford was doing with his assembly line, and made it capable for any organization to do that, not by hand, but within this tabulator. So if you could afford the Packard, instead of having to do these calculations one at a time, spending hours and hours to do it, you could instead run these through the Packard, which would still take hours and hours to do with programming of punch cards and all the different things that were the outside of computing sciences, but it would do it at a quicker rate and more accurately than humans. And that's really the key point, is it was more accurate. The less manual intervention there was, the more accurate those numbers were, the more efficient your organization could be. Okay, 1996, Ralph Kimball releases the Data Warehouse Toolkit. Ralph Kimball was someone who had been experienced in the data world for multiple decades at this point. He had worked at Xerox and produced some really groundbreaking data structures and software there. And later in his career, he wrote this book, The Data Warehouse Toolkit, which is still used today as the foremost text on modern dimensional modeling and relational structures. So this is really the driving force of the new architecture and what we call today the infrastructure of data at organizations. And then finally, in 1999, Salesforce begins delivering enterprise applications online. This is the introduction of what we experience every day now, the introduction of cloud. Salesforce was really the driving force behind that. Amazon then kicked off in 2002 and started to produce all of its services on the cloud. Whereas Salesforce did initially have solutions both on-prem and in the cloud. But what this means is not only are these applications being maintained online, which means that you have more or less unlimited processing power, which means you can process more data as long as you can pay for it. It means that you can share your analytics across countries, across states, across cities, to any of your coworkers or anyone, maybe your clients need to see that data. So you can start to do that, but you can also start to collect additional data. So this is after that Business Week article published, and this is really where massive mounds and mountains of data collection really started, because once data collection was being driven by web traffic, you could collect data on anyone as long as they had a touch point along one of your collection points. Okay, so here's the data maturity timeline. And this I mentioned a little bit before. Adoption of data in the workplace has grown and changed in scope as technology has changed over the last 100+ years. Initially, the cost barrier meant efficiencies through data were only available to global enterprise and governmental entities. So think of the Packard. That was very elite, and only the very elite organizations could afford to use it. So Columbia, believe, was being contracted by the United States government to build a variety of different technologies, and the Packard was supporting those different technologies. Um, IBM would install the Packard at companies like GM and Texas Instruments. And all of these organizations are these massive global enterprises that we think of when we think of the birth of computer programming and modern technology. However, then the personal computer comes around. And with the proliferation of the personal computer, development of open source software, and the increase in educational opportunities, smaller organizations and even individual operators now have the power of data at their fingertips. Things like what we're doing right now, having the ability to access different statistics around even the data industry itself, that wouldn't have been possible before personal computing. Once personal computing hit the scene, that barrier to entry really diminished and gave smaller organizations a fighting chance to compete with those larger enterprises, and ultimately be more agile about it, which is something we'll cover in another discussion session. But now everyone could be competitive. You were all operating on the same playing field. So along the data maturity timeline, organizations go through 6 phases: unaware, aware, reactive, proactive, managed, and effective. So unaware is you don't know what data you have, you don't know what data you should have, you don't know what data one business unit has over another business unit, just fully unaware of what data is available within an organization. Often you find this at organizations that are paper driven or on-prem driven, those that haven't migrated to higher technologies. And that is ultimately where most organizations start, but unfortunately too many organizations stay at. So this next phase is aware. So this is kind of a crawl, walk, run approach to data usage. So when organizations become aware of their data, it is the opportunity to start thinking strategically, but ultimately it's asking questions like, how do I count this? How many of this item do we have in our warehouse? Basic things like counting and structuring data, understanding basic demographics, those are all within the aware segment of the data maturity timeline. Next is reactive. So this is a point in time in which the organization is able to do analysis and to use their data productively, but there is no proactivity. So there's no thinking ahead and identifying this could be a problem in the future. So I'm going to use data to solve that problem now so it doesn't become an issue. Instead, reactive only responds to issues that are currently happening. So maybe the the engineering department of an organization isn't able to meet timelines, And so that is causing products to not get out in time. So then data is collected around why those timelines aren't being met, how the tasks within engineering are being monitored and tracked, and then ultimately identifying where those issues and blockers lie and fixing it. So that's really a reactive use case towards data. Something is currently a problem, and so now we're going to go and fix it using data. Moving on to proactive, that is the exact opposite. So proactive is identifying where those problems may exist in the future and fixing them before they're issues. So you may you may have your data structured, it's no longer siloed, you're able to do X, Y, and Z, and HR is concerned because they don't have insight into maybe the demographic span of current resources. And so instead of being proactive to to something coming out about the company about not being diverse, or within the company themselves, they find that they are losing profits because of lack of perspective. Instead, proactive solutions are driving that HR problem that's not a problem yet, to identify where gaps are and how they can be filled. Managed is when data becomes truly structured. So this is where relational databases, data warehouses, data lakes, all of the infrastructure behind large-scale data solutions fits. So the data is truly managed. It's maintained by a defined group of individuals, and is more effective because of that. And then finally, we get to the state of effectiveness. And that is where there's a centralized location of data that is available to all users within the organization. And because of that, individuals themselves can drive effectiveness from their own work streams. So individuals are making decisions based on data, not just analysts or C-level individuals, but everyday workers are driving that data usage. Okay, what's next in the data industry? So there's a couple things I wanted to touch on, some because they're extremely exciting and some because I think they're very interesting. So one really exciting idea as of late is the idea of 100% streaming. And where that comes from is the understanding that in transactional databases, there is truly active data constantly. And within organizations that have transactional databases, most will have some sort of streaming information, whether it's coming in from an application, whether it's coming in from a sensor. Some event tracking is happening at most data mature organizations. Migration to 100% streaming would, instead of having batch files for smaller, less frequent data events, there would be streaming for any given data point that's being input into the data warehouse. And this has implications on profit margins, processing time, warehouse sizes, all different things. But it is something that's really exciting coming into data that has a huge impact on how quickly data is received by the end user of an organization and how much organizations are spending on their data solutions. So wherever you can squeeze a penny out of any given transaction into the database, if you squeeze that penny out millions and millions and millions of times, then you're going to see a significant profit change. Okay, fraud and security. This is kind of a double-edged sword as we continue to grow in data capabilities, particularly within business. There are greater opportunities for fraud. People often where fraud becomes the biggest problem is at the point of human intervention. So as people become more comfortable with data, and as data is less siloed, and as data within businesses is more frequently available to more users, the ability to be fraudulent within that organization, so to send out phishing attacks and ransomware and to access that data is a lot higher, especially as technology around both security and security threats continues to increase. However, we are also seeing impacts on security itself. So there are analyses that are able to identify where the largest problems are within your organization. There are data structures that are specifically built to maintain security for a given organization. So not necessarily just the data itself, but the data that is driving security. So about role-based access and row access and column access, all of those kind of things are driving capabilities for security in the industry. And then finally, a really interesting thing that I think is cool because I have pets is the Internet of Pets. And this is an extrapolation of Internet of Things. We're starting to see companies like Whisper and a couple others that I can't think of right now, creating sensors for people's pets. And so it's not only tracking sensors, but you're seeing health-related sensors being marketed to pet owners. So what's your pet's heart rate right now? What's your pet's heart rate when they're running? What's your pet's heart rate when they're sleeping? Measuring different chemicals. So like you can swab your pet and have it measure the different chemicals in their saliva, just to make sure that their health is as expected. So we're starting to see all of these different sensors and activity-based data coming into the pet industry, which in general, the pet industry is an extremely large industry. It drives a lot of profit, particularly within we would consider wealthier countries. And so seeing this Internet of Pets come into fruition is an indication that that we're going to start seeing more of these organizations focus specifically on those who have they have greater disposable income and also are focused around operating as their pet is their child. And that's definitely a trend that's been growing. Okay, so that's really all I had. I wanted to spend some time having discussion time, so I will stop sharing my screen in just a second. But I did want to touch on the year for Salt City Data Community. So throughout the year, we're looking to do 4 speaker sessions, 1 a quarter. So you can expect to see those coming up. We plan on having 12 discussion sessions, 1 a month. So similarly to today's meeting, there would be some content provided, and then time to have a discussion around that content and really dig into questions and ideas. And then we're looking to have 3 workshops throughout the year, and those are workshops dedicated to building a thing or identifying infrastructure and walking through the build of infrastructure, or creating a design workshop where we can design relational databases together. So those are going to be the really interactive days where we will be walking through tutorials. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing, and so I saw that Hillary, you're our only survivor. You made it through the entire presentation. What are your thoughts about how data impacts business?
Well, I think this is all very interesting, so I'm glad you provided this. One thing that I think would be interesting within this is like how data is used from large companies as compared to medium or small size companies, because obviously Amazon can collect and do what, I'm sure they have data science teams, analytics teams, predictive, anything they want with the data, whereas maybe a
Right.
mid-size or small-size company doesn't have those resources or those capabilities, but I would think they still have some data needs. So I think that would be something interesting to look at it as how it's used either the same or differently within different size companies.
Definitely, and that's a really good point. Companies like, and this is one we're going to focus on because they do have a very comprehensive usage of data across the organization, and that's Instacart. And so organizations like Instacart, not only are they data first organizations, but they're large global enterprises where they do have the resources and funds and technical savvy to work with data from the outset of their organization, whereas other organizations are 20, 40, 60 years old and need to migrate across usage of manual maintenance of records, actually keeping physical paper records, maintaining things in Excel spreadsheets, and then migrating up to whatever that newest technology is. And that's a very different story than organizations like Instacart or Amazon or Google or any other large enterprise that really does have the capabilities to do whatever they want.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, that is interesting. And there's also, like you mentioned, there's large companies, but they're older companies, so they're kind of stuck behind, and they haven't leveraged data. I don't know if it's on that scale, like you said, if they have it but don't know what to do with it, or exactly what the situation is there.
Yeah, that actually that's always an interesting thing to dive into, because you would think those larger organizations would have gotten on the data bandwagon by now, but like I think of GE, who just a couple years ago, at this point it might be 8 years ago, but they had to do a massive reorganization and divest a ton of their assets, their business units. They brought in a new CEO because the organization had been failing for years. And the reason they'd been failing for years is because they hadn't been paying attention to their business data. They continued to branch out into industries that were not central to the GE priority, and they didn't focus on what was their central tenants. And by pairing the data and understanding their profits in different centers, with their customer data around sentiment and ideas of interest, particularly what do you think of when you think of GE? Like that is a very important question and identification of sentiment with any given organization. So if you think of GE and you think appliances, but you don't think of IoT, it means that their IoT arm is unnecessary. And so by not using that data, they went through this whole reorganization that cost them a ton of money and eventually pulled them back into a profitable organization, but it took them a while because of their lack of data and innovation.
Yeah, and then you also, I look at companies that didn't make it, like Sears. It's kind of like, what were you thinking there? I mean, like there had to be data there. You have to have some idea what the market wants and what Sears is bringing in, and you just feel like, what, wasn't anyone looking at any of this? You know, you think Sears, they look like they're in the 1950s. Well, not now, they're gone, but
Right.
you know, they just
Right.
didn't keep up at all with like the targets, and then you know the newer companies, and like
Right. And
was there
even
any
older,
data there? I mean, what were they looking at?
yeah, I don't even know. And you can see players in that industry who did use data effectively. So, like if you look at Walmart is, I don't know, maybe 100 years old. I believe they're in the fourth generation of Waltons, so that gets us to about 100 years. And they massively changed their approach to messaging, marketing, sales, what they put into their different lines, how they approach their generic brand because of the data they collected. Whereas organizations like Sears clearly did not do that and did not innovate as other organizations did with their data analysis.
Yeah, you would think like someone referred to Sears as like the first Amazon because they had the catalog out, you know, years ago. That was like a big and new thing, and that didn't just it never translated to online, I guess.
Yeah, which is just like you said, it's really interesting considering they had been so innovative at the outset and then stopped. You know, they were that leader in the industry and then expected that to be maintained because they had been the leader. Whereas I think nowadays there is no room to take that for granted. You always have to be innovating and comparing against others in your industry because particularly the data is so quickly growing and can be applied to any business decision making fairly quickly.
Yeah, that's true. And now when you refer to like data, usage of data, are you referring to anything from like spreadsheets to Power BI to data science and predictive analytics? Like, are you talking about the whole spectrum there?
Oh yeah, whole gamut.
Mhm.
So obviously, as we talked about with data maturity, there are organizations who are using data in very different ways from other organizations. But any migration from unaware to any of those further phases is going to see innovation at every step. You're going to see changes within the organization. So, for example, um, I used to work in the public sector, and we did this project with the permits department for a municipality, and that permits department had been fully paper based. And by migrating simply to the records on paper to the records in an Excel spreadsheet, the efficiencies grew. We did we used a people counter from this company called Density to count how many people came in and out of the permits office on a given basis. And so with that first step to Excel, more people were being cycled in and out of the permits department on a regular basis. And then we did additional migration into use of online permitting because we surveyed contractors and others who used the permits department on a regular basis, and they expressed interest in being able to do that on the web. And so then those people counters saw fewer and fewer people actually entering the permits department, even though when people came, they were being cycled out more quickly because of the efficiencies from the previous step. But in this next step, you're seeing fewer people needing to actually go. So any step from unaware to any usage of data, be it Excel, Power BI, I shudder to say it, but even Access, if you're working from nothing, anything else is going to improve and innovate the work that you do.
Yeah, I confess we have a lot of Access databases, and some of them are like Access on the front end and SQL on the back end, because it started out as a progression up from using CSV files and Excel files. So Access was a step up, and then we went to SQL Server on the back end, and now they're kind of looking at, oh, okay, what's next? Because we have all these Access databases out there, and that's not really the best use of technology. But yeah, like you said, it serves its purpose for certain things.
Exactly. And compared to paper, those Access databases are getting you where you need to go. And
Right.
not only getting you where you need to go, but getting the organization thinking about their data. So it changes the mindset and the frame of mind that people approach their data with, just by doing that initial step. Now they're thinking, okay, what next? As opposed to when things were on paper, it was just kind of like there.
Right.
Okay. Did you have any other questions around this kind of stuff?
No, I think it'll be interesting to get into the more, the individual industries and see how that goes too.
Well, yeah, we hope to see you. We haven't scheduled February session yet, but we're gonna have that out soon. We just need to decide on an industry. Actually, since we have you on the call, do you have any industry preferences that we can work into our list?
Actually, offhand, no, I don't. I think you had mentioned healthcare and finance. I think those would be interesting.
Yeah, I think our list right now includes healthcare, finance, education, public sector. I think we're going to split public sector into like municipal public sector and then like federal public sector because they operate very differently in the ways they approach data.
Right.
Data first organizations, online services. So we have a bunch that we're going to cover. But yeah, if you think of anything that you would want, don't hesitate to reach out to us. If you think of people or topics you'd like for speaker sessions, we're always looking for ideas. And we want to engage you and the rest of the community as much as possible because we want to be presenting information that people are interested in and want to talk about.
Okay, yeah, that's good to know.
Well, thank you so much